May 23rd, 2002, or the Morton Tornado Day, wasn't a day projected to produce many, if any, tornadoes at all when looking the day or two ahead. The Synoptic Meteorology didn't scream 9 confirmed tornadoes on the day, as per the SPC filtered storm report confirms. In fact, the primary risk for tornadoes on this day wasn't in Texas at all, it was in North and South Carolina. It was projected as far more of a large hail threat or mesoscale convective system that later in the day may have produced a flash flooding risk, which did end up happening later that night. In terms of the Synoptic Meteorology, May 22nd was extremely quiet across the plains as far as storms were concerned, so for us it was a transit day to relocate for the 23rd. We drove from Oklahoma City to Abilene, Texas. The Storm Prediction Center had highlighted a broad slight risk area with a 2% tornado risk across much of Texas, and we, at least in the morning, felt west of Abilene through the Texas Panhandle was the large, broad target area. We basically agreed with the Storm Prediction Center's very large area of concern. The Panhandle was only 2.5 hours away if we chose to pivot to the northwest in the morning, which we did after looking at the morning obs and getting a punctured tire fixed. While the main front-loaded part of the strong upper-level trough was still far west of Texas in the afternoon of the 23rd, some notable mid-level subtle short waves were embedded in the mid-level flow, and at least one was progged to eject into West Texas by the early afternoon. With weak capping in place, rapid upscaling were the main concerns in terms of discrete storm mode failures that we had in mind. Effective bulk shear values by the late afternoon reached between 40 and 50 knots, which were supportive of supercells if they were able to maintain discrete mode and hadn't upscaled by this point. A weak surface low in central New Mexico was the source, allowing for favorable southeasterlies and even easterlies at the surface and moisture advection from the Gulf of Mexico. West Texas by the late afternoon saw surface-based Cape values jump up to 2,000 joules per kilogram and dew points approaching nearly 60 degrees, which for that area is enough for severe storms because of the higher elevation terrain. And in addition to this, a strengthening low-level jet later in the day would help increase low-level storm relative helicity for ongoing storms. But overall, nothing about this event, synoptically speaking thus far that I've stated, jumped out in terms of a notable tornado risk. Conditions barely reached severe thunderstorm criteria until the afternoon, when moisture advection began to reaching expected severe weather thresholds. If this was the case, why did 9 confirmed tornadoes and 2 EF2s happen on this day? After storm initiation began in the afternoon, which began as multi-cells firing in close proximity to each other west of Morton, Texas, the eventual dominant cyclical supercell likely became tornadic due to multiple favorable cell mergers, especially in the phase before the first Morton, Texas tornado occurrence. Every subsequent cell merger into the dominant supercell produced an uptick in velocities and eventually tornado genesis. You will see this begin as the tornado crosses the road right behind us and the velocities skyrocket while we're facing the mesocyclone. Not all mergers and supercells do this, of course. Some are constructive, some are destructive. The destructive ones destroy tornado genesis entirely, or they delay it because the supercell now has to sort itself out again before it becomes tornadic. In the Morton, Texas tornado case, especially early on, this was not the case. It was purely constructive. After dropping slightly south to avoid the tornado, we figured it would continue on its easterly heading, or in another case, take a more deviant east-southeast heading, and because of this, we looked for an easterly paved road option. The tornado at this point, once we found this easterly option, began its occlusion, started to head north, and then eventually tracked northwest, all while this was wedging out while happening. We were forced to then backtrack north and at least saw the wedge before it became rain-wrapped and then eventually died out entirely. Shortly after the mergers, the now primary supercell began to take a more deviant storm motion relative to the mean flow as it began to travel to the east-southeast as we thought it would in the first tornado production. Being cyclical in nature, the supercell produced multiple tornadoes throughout its duration from here. You can see the irregular motions in a few of the tornado tracks on the Tornado Archive graphic I showed earlier, especially the first one encountered north of Morton, which ended up producing a track in the form of a backward C shape. This first one was rated EF2. As one tornado formed and occluded, another couplet began forming and produced another tornado not too long after this. After these first visible tornadoes occurred, the few more that were reported to the northeast of Morton and then eventually the later ones to the northwest of Levelland were far more difficult to spot because of the very dusty conditions of drought-stricken area of West Texas. At this point too, because it was one dominant supercell, the inflow spiked, so the increased winds increased the dust flow. You will see in the video that despite taking the off-roads and being in close range multiple times, the only structure visibility were wall clouds, mesocyclones, and basically a wall of dust. While many of these shorter tracks were rated EFU, or unknown, the longer track with the occlusion to the north was rated EF2. The longest track tornado of the day, which was this one, had by far the least amount of footage gathered on it because of this dust. We stopped along the way for some great structure shots and ended the day in Lubbock. Reflectivity was still very high as the supercell was coming into town, which alerted us to the risk of potential hail, but we suspected the incredible amount of dust in the inflow that supercell was taking in at this point was skewing this measure slightly, because only small hail was being reported, and when we were hit with only heavy rain, so that was our suspicion. As a side note and a closing point, as a comparative analog, this cyclical supercell event that started as a low-risk tornado event and transformed into a prolific tornado producer with moments of being stationary and displaying deviant motion wasn't unlike the cyclical supercell event near Demet, Texas on April 14, 2017. It had a similar setup with near stationary motion early on, with many different cell mergers in the forward and rear flank downdraft regions before amalgamating into one dominant supercell and producing a wedge tornado, which, going by what I've basically illustrated to you earlier, doesn't sound that much different. It was the first thought on my mind as the day was winding down and when we first got back to the hotel, and truth be told, as much as it's not a perfect analog, I do believe it holds some merit. In general, it goes to show you that cell mergers, even in a less than perfect synoptic environment, can still put forth unexpected results, and results that both can put on a show and actually pose quite a bit of a danger to you if you aren't careful and keep your wits about you when out in the field. Until next time.